When someone dies prematurely, we see it as a tragedy. At funerals, Christians often say that the loved one is in a better place. But there is a tension here. If heaven is always better than anything we can experience here on earth, then why is death bad for a Christian? Why don't Christians long for death or even pray for it to come sooner? Instead, like everyone else, they delay it as long as possible. In this interview, I'm joined by the Christian philosopher Dr. Taylor Sear to explore this question. You'll hear some possible answers, some of which are very surprising. This conversation offers fresh insight into how we think about death, the afterlife, and what matters in this life. Welcome, I'm Jordan, and this is The Analytic Christian. Let's get started. Dr. Sear, what is this puzzle concerning death for the paradise bound, the people that are going to heaven, so to speak?
Well, the puzzle is intuitively, death is bad for the person who dies. And that's just a common assumption, even among people who think that they or loved ones who have already passed away are headed to heaven, headed to paradise. This is very common in the Christian tradition, but in lots of other religious traditions too. It's this idea of going to a better place. So the puzzle is, how can you reconcile this common kind of intuitive belief or assumption that death is a bad thing for the person who's died, but also that, at least in some cases, that very person might be in heaven, headed for heaven, paradise bound, that sort of thing. So, I mean, it's not that hard to see what the puzzle is. If you've ever been to a funeral especially at a church where the person was a Christian and everyone there like takes that person to have genuinely been a Christian, they really are, headed for heaven. It's not uncommon, at least in my own experience, for there to be this tension between grief on behalf of the person who's died, but also the sense that, well, we're kind of grieving for us, but not for them, right?
Right.
They're in a better
Yeah,
place.
exactly.
Yeah. And that's the puzzle. Like, how could it really be that it's bad for them to have died if they are in a better place and yeah, things are better for them at each moment that they're there in paradise than any moment that they would have been here had they lived longer. So yeah, I guess I got interested in this puzzle because lots of people who work on the philosophy of death are non-religious, they're secular and just assume, and this goes back all the way to the ancients with Epicurus and other kind of ancient atomists. They just sort of assume that death is the end of your existence. And so, when you're dead, you're not experiencing any pain, you're not suffering any other evils. So it's kind of hard on that sort of view to see how death could be bad if it doesn't involve, pain, suffering, these sorts of things. But I was kind of interested in thinking, well, as a Christian, as someone who unfortunately has grieved the loss of friends who died much younger than they ought to have in some sense,
Mm.
right? Like, what do I think about whether death could be bad for that sort of person? So anyway, the puzzle kind of relies on a couple of assumptions about heaven or paradise. One is that, it really is paradise or heaven, right? To be, say, in God's presence is to be in a much happier state than I've ever been in this, earthly life. So for each moment that someone's in paradise, I'm sort of just assuming in my work, it's better for that person to be there in that state than to be absent from that state, from paradise. So that's one of the kind of key assumptions. Another thing that I assume, I'm not sure how much really depends on this, but it's easier to make diagrams if you assume this. Like, I think of heaven, paradise, even as a Christian, thinking about the promised resurrection of the dead, the end of times. I think of all that in temporal terms. So we still go on existing the way we do now, experiencing one moment after another, not all of our life all at once, like maybe God exists if he's timeless. So anyway, if you think of it that way, it's easier to see how it's like, well, there's time in heaven or there's time in paradise and there's time here on earth and they run parallel to each other. So for each moment that you're not in heaven and that you go on existing without dying prematurely, you're missing out on some time in heaven, right? But one difference between the two lines is that this life always comes to an end, but paradise, heaven is everlasting life. Those are a couple of things I'm sort of assuming in the background.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we've got the puzzle on the table and you have that helpful diagram that shows those kinds of parallel timelines.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you mentioned some unsatisfactory answers to the question or to the puzzle. So maybe just sketch what these unsatisfactory answers are.
Yeah, so I've been talking about this with people for a while. I wrote this paper 10 years ago, and before that, I had been chatting with people kind of off and on about thoughts on these things. And some of the suggestions that came up, which I think are helpful, interesting kind of first thoughts to have about the puzzle, I thought ultimately couldn't be worked into a full solution. So one of those is that, like, well, if you, this is sort of like the selfish one, but it comes up a lot. Like, if you die, say at 20 or 25, or God forbid, much earlier, it seems like your death is worse in some sense than if you had died at, say, 80 or 90, because there's all these temporal goods of this life that you miss out on that might not be available in heaven or in paradise. Now, there are some things that we do in this life that won't be in heaven, like sin or other evils. And even if you take some pleasure, and that's probably not the sort of thing that we should count as like, oh, too bad I missed
You
out
missed
on
out on
that.
those goods, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. But there are others that are, I think, more serious. So in the New Testament, Jesus specifically says that in heaven, people aren't married or given in marriage. And so it seems like the goods of marriage are limited to this life. Okay, so I think that's an interesting suggestion. It does seem like there's something incomplete. The life is cut short if it doesn't have the full narrative that we anticipate. There's probably other things that you could say to flesh that out. But again, I'm sort of assuming in the background that regardless of how good, what kinds of goods you're getting in this temporal life, if we're contrasting the goods of this life with the goods of paradise, the goods of paradise are just going to be greater in kind, maybe if you're getting, say, direct access to God, the beatific vision or something like that. Or there's just there's like no tinge of sadness or evil in paradise. So it seems like regardless of what kinds of goods you might be missing out on there, like all things considered, each moment of paradise is going to be better than any possible moment of this temporal life. So that's one of I call it a satisfactory answer. I think there's something to this idea that the life's cut short, it's incomplete. A more theological way of putting it might be that's not the way things are supposed to be. Like death in a biblical story is a curse and it's something to be overcome. So there's something bad about it, but at the same time, all things considered, for that person, right? Not, of course, we're talking about for that person, right? Like there's lots of bads involved for their loved ones, for the world, missing their absence. But for that person, I'll come back to this in a minute, but to die is gain is another line from the New Testament.
Right,
So
right.
yeah. So that's why I think that can't quite work, not for selfish reasons. Another thing I've heard some people say, and this is less selfish, more maybe altruistic, others centered, is like, well, once you leave this world and go to heaven, you're not able to improve this world in various ways. So, maybe, you can't be there for your loved ones. You can't, I don't know, you can't proselytize, right? Can't evangelize. You can't, help to solve some social problem, help to do research that might lead to a cure for cancer. Like all these things you miss out on because now you're away from this world when you enter into paradise. And again, I think there's something to that, and that's all true. But then again, if we're assuming that for you to be in paradise is to be experiencing all these goods that just trump the goods of this life, right? Then for you, it's not an all things considered loss to be missing out on even all those good things you might do for the world. So yeah, I think those are interesting starting points, but ultimately unsatisfactory as solutions.
Yeah. Before we move to solutions that you think would solve the puzzle, let me just follow up on the solutions that we've just kind of taken
Hmm.
off the table. I guess one thought is, could somebody say, in response to like what you just said, could somebody say, as long as there are any negatives still involved, isn't it isn't it in some sense a correct judgment or something like
Mhm.
that. Like, if you're evaluating the situation, isn't it in some sense a correct judgment to be saddened? So, let me give
Yeah. That's a
I was
great
trying to think of an
suggestion. Yeah.
example. Let me give, like, a different example. Say there's, like, a high school student who applies to some, like, super fantastic college that's gonna, like, give her the exact career that she wants, and she's gonna make a huge difference in the world by doing that career, but she has to, like, move country, like, she has to move across the world
Mhm.
to study at this institution, and in doing that, she's gonna be, like, missing out on all this time with her family that she really values or something.
Right.
So, it seems like you could look at that and be like, "Look, all things considered, it's really good for you to go to the
Mm.
institution and make this big difference in the world." Like, say she goes and ends up finding the cure for cancer or something, like, it would be amazing, like, you should totally
Right.
go. But in some sense, it's still a correct thing for her, not just her family, but for her to be saddened that she has to leave her family. What do you think about a scenario like that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That's exactly what I would say about that sort of case. Yeah, I guess if all it takes for death to be bad, including for the person who's headed for heaven, is just that there's some aspect of it. We might call it like a pro tanto bad, so something that counts against it, even if it doesn't kind of play a deciding role. It's not a deciding factor. Then I think it's pretty easy to solve the puzzle. Then because of course there are things you're either missing out on. I think that's an easy way to make sense of it. You're deprived of some good earthly good or something along those lines. So yeah, I think that's right. And you also said that maybe this could help to make sense of the sort of the sense, maybe an emotional sense that there's something worth grieving in the case, or that there's something to be sad about. You might even wonder, even if you are, headed for heaven, whether it could be appropriate to fear death. And I've sort of steered clear of that question in my work, but I think that these questions are related because if death can't be bad, at least this is what some of the ancients thought, like Epicurus and his Roman follower Lucretius. If death can't be bad for you, it kind of seems like you shouldn't fear it.
Sure,
Like, don't
sure.
let don't let this bother you if it's not going to be bad for you. So maybe that's right, but it's complicated. But anyway, if there's something that's bad about death, I think that is a kind of hook to attach emotions like sadness and grief to, that make them reasonable in response to the death of someone, even if they're headed for paradise. So I think it's been a while since I wrote this paper, but I think John Fisher said something along those lines to me, and I might have put it in a footnote. But if there's some pro tanto bad about the death, even of someone who, all things considered, they're in a better place, it's not bad for them, all things considered. Like that could be relevant to how we think of, say, a funeral of someone who's headed for heaven. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move to the solutions that you thought these solve the puzzle, and tell me if I'm understanding based on what you just said. I gave you a scenario where it's like, "Hey, as long as there's any" you're using pro tanto. Why
Hmm.
don't you I'm not sure if all my viewers will be familiar with that terminology. Can you maybe give there's usually a helpful illustration with cookies or cake that people give to illustrate this, but whatever illustration you want, explain what pro tanto means.
I don't know the illustration with cookies or cake. I just think of it as like it's a reason. It's like it's a it's if you're making a pros and cons list, it's a tally in one of those columns or something like that. But it doesn't tell you about the whole set of tally marks, right? And so, maybe the way we figure out whether something's all things considered bad is by looking at all of the pro tanto fors and againsts. This is ungrammatical. But anyway, and then we make a sort of all things considered judgment. And so, yeah, in your example, someone, moving across the country, making various sacrifices for something that it maybe in some sense like justifies making all those sacrifices. It's worth it, right? It's not all things considered or irrational or anything like that. But there are these pro tanto bads or costs or something like that.
Mhm. Okay, so with I'll leave out the cookies and cake. Yeah, I think you got the point across. So, what I did was one way of trying to s solve the puzzle is by, I guess, setting the bar really low. Like, as long as there's any badness involved, then we can make sense of this kind of like, oh, I guess it's deprivation, right? It's like
Mhm.
you're being deprived of something. And so that's the bad that's involved. Even if all things considered, it's good, there's still a little bit of bad, and it makes sense that way. But with the solutions that you're proposing in the paper, this was going to be my question. We're going to get to those solutions in just a moment. But whatever those solutions are they going to solve the puzzle all things when you don't set the bar low, you leave it
Right.
high, like all things considered, this state of affairs is not bad. It's actually very good. And yeah, so is
Yeah,
that
that's right.
okay?
Yeah. Yeah, so as we'll see, there's like two main types of solution that I sketch, and I lean towards the first, but I'm gonna give like three versions of the second type. And in some moods, I can see the attraction of at least one or two of them. So, but anyway, the first main type is gonna say, actually, all things considered, even death isn't bad for the person who is going to heaven at least. And that's sort of striking, maybe. And as I said at the beginning, that's sort of against the intuitive belief of many people. But then the other type of response or solution to the puzzle will say, yeah, it actually can be all things considered bad for these reasons. But yeah, the bar is we're talking about whether death is bad, all things considered. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's helpful. Okay, so try to make it b try to make that first solution more plausible because obviously the kinda common sense view is, "Hey, death is bad," like,
Mhm.
so explain how it is that it wouldn't be bad.
Right. Yeah, and I guess I've already hinted at some of the ways that I want to sort of soften the blow of accepting this kind of view. For example, there are obviously pro tanto bads about a person's death, even if they're headed to heaven. There's a lot to grieve. uh, This is not the way things are meant to be. All those things I think are true, but it still seems to a lot of people like, well, still, like all things considered, right? It would have been better for that person to have gone on living, especially when we think of people who die much earlier than is the norm, right? Everyone's death is premature in some sense, but then, there are some that come much earlier and catch everyone off guard. And in those kinds of cases, it really does seem like all things considered, like that it would have been better for them to have gone on living, not to have died. Okay, so the that's like the big challenge for just denying that death can be bad for the person who's paradise bound. But there's, as I mentioned earlier, a little bit of biblical evidence for the view that actually, to die is gain, right? So there's some sense in which we should like value our continued life. Paul in the New Testament says to live as Christ. But then should we regard death as a bad thing? Well, maybe not if it's actually gain, if it's better for the person. And then when you really think about like going back to that diagram, right? Every moment in paradise is better for that person than any possible moment of this temporal life, right? They're, say, with Christ or united with God. They're getting what their soul longs for, right? It's not so counterintuitive, I think, to just say, oh, actually, yeah, for that person, all things considered, it's actually good for them and not bad for sure to be in paradise. So, yeah, I'm okay with accepting something that at least maybe initially seemed counterintuitive. I think the way that philosophers, theologians, people in other disciplines too think about, you know, evidence for and against certain views, especially when we're appealing to things like intuitions or common sense. I think you have to take stock and then form an all things considered judgment about the view, and something that might have initially seemed counterintuitive, like denying that death is bad for someone. When you start thinking about well, what it would mean for that person to be in paradise, and how that compares to living longer and not having the premature death, I don't think it's irrational to say, well, I'm going to accept what was counterintuitive before. Maybe it's not even counterintuitive to me anymore, given all this new information.
Yeah, and I think tell me if I'm understanding this correctly. This solution seems very plausible if we can make sense of this. The people say we're at a funeral, especially of I've too have had friends that have died prematurely. Say we're at a funeral in such a case, it can still be like an appropriate response for the people attending the funeral to be sad. It's not like by saying their death wasn't bad, all things considered. It's not as though that means so grieving is an inappropriate response or
Right.
something like that, or experiencing sadness is not an appropriate response. You're not saying that.
Right.
You think, no, it can be, and in most cases is, an appropriate response for them to grieve and be saddened.
I think that.
And I think maybe that's what the common sense is kind of, at least to me as I reflect on it, my common sense is tracking more their responses
Mhm.
to the situation, and it seems like as long as we can preserve that sort of response as appropriate, then I can it doesn't feel so hard to make sense
Right.
of their death, the person who died in this case, is all things considered not bad.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. So I've been to I thought of it as a funeral that was redescribed as a praise service or a kind of celebration of a person's life. And that's not that out of the ordinary, but some people, when they start really thinking, well, maybe this, it's better for this person to be with the Lord and not to continue to live longer here. The tone can sometimes shift to, let's not grieve anymore. Let's just celebrate that this person lived this life, but also celebrate they're in a better place. And I think that can be detrimental to the mental and emotional health of loved ones who really ought to be grieving. Grieving is an appropriate, fitting response when someone that you love passes away. So, yeah, I'm not committed to the irrationality of grieving or other negative emotions about a person's death, even if you kind of hold in maybe intention with that, but also, maintain that the person is better off. There's still these pro tanto bads about their death, and it does make sense to grieve. I do think so. Maybe that helps you. Maybe you're convinced this is the way to go. I think this is where I am most days, but there's still something odd if you think about what that means for you going on living now, knowing that if you were to die at any minute, it would be better for you. Like, that's not how we normally think. That is, I think, still a little bit counterintuitive. One of my favorite bands, as far as I know, totally secular, but Dawes has this line in a song, "If heaven was all that was promised to me, why don't I pray for my death?"
Mm,
And it does seem wrong to pray for your death. But then again, I think, yeah, praying for your death or asking to be with the Lord sooner, that might seem in tension with certain other things that you're, commanded to do in scripture or that you see as part of a good life. But still, you have that line, Paul's, that like, well, if I were to die, that would be gain. And
yeah.
so I think I'm okay with holding all those things together. But for a lot of people, that is still a bit counterintuitive.
I may take this out of the video depending on how stupid I end up sounding by asking this question, but this thought just popped in my head.
Yeah.
It relates to the problem of evil. If you end up adopting this solution,
Mm.
I wonder, and maybe help me think through this, does it end up looking like God's permission for our lives to go on longer actually ends up looking like he's a gratuitous evil? Like,
Mm.
if all things considered,
Hmm.
it would be better for me to die and now I get it, this won't work for at least if you're holding on to kind of orthodox Christian views
Hmm.
about, like, say, you need to believe certain things in order to receive salvation. Like, we're
Yeah.
holding that stuff fixed, but at least for believers, it's like, once somebody's
Right.
saved, like, why doesn't God, as soon as somebody's saved, just car wreck or so I don't know, something,
Yeah.
and
Right.
then you're immediately in heaven, and it's like if God allows you to go on living, then it looks like he's allowing gratuitous evil at that point. Does that
Yeah.
run you into a problem with adopting this solution?
It might, and I think it might depend on your other broader theological commitments, but you might think, and this is again related to what you think are the sort of conditions for entering into paradise. And if it does involve, belief, entering into the Christian community or something like that, it might be that part of the reason why God doesn't just pluck each person who's converted and take them to heaven immediately is precisely so that others could hear the message, could join the church, that sort of thing. So you could try to use those sort of kind of, I don't know, justifying reasons why God would allow people to go on in an inferior condition. But um to me, I think I haven't thought about this very much, but I guess the way I think about it is if God were to do that, I don't know if this would just send a message or be contrary to like his normal plan for, human life, right? Death isn't something that's like supposed to be a good thing used as a means to bring about some good, right? It's a curse or it's punishment or something like that. It's an enemy to be overcome. And so I still want to think of it as like, you know, something that we wouldn't want to hope for,
Right. Yeah.
even in our own lives, even if we think once it comes, it will be better for me.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move to that second type of solution to the problem. Now, there's like three versions of it, but
Right.
I guess the broad picture, all three are trying to say, all things considered, death still is bad,
Yes.
even for those who are paradise bound.
Right.
Whereas your solution denies that kind of it solves the puzzle by just denying the kind of common sense
Yeah.
intuition that death is all things considered bad.
Right.
Okay, so I guess in order, I think you start with purgatory if you want to
Dude. Yeah.
explain each of these three solutions.
Yeah. And I will start with purgatory. Each of the three versions of this type of response will say something about how even for someone who's headed to paradise, they're deprived of some good or they're deprived of some opportunity to avoid an evil or suffering. They're deprived of those of good things by an earlier death. And what's interesting about that is I wanted for these different versions of this solution to be kind of structurally similar to one of the really popular views in the sort of secular literature on death and immortality about why death is bad, even if we assume death is an experiential blank, it's just the end of your existence. And the most popular view is usually just called the deprivation view. The idea is death is bad for you, at least when it is bad for you, it's because it deprives you of various goods or goods that, you wanted or that you cared about or that there's lots of versions of this, that it was rational for you to care about or something of those lines. So purgatory, one kind of model of the afterlife is, and this you really see this in Dante and Divine Comedy with the sort of three kingdoms of the afterlife. There's not only paradise and hell, which gets the most attention, Inferno, but there's also this middle place, purgatory, which when I teach the Divine Comedy to students here at Samford, a lot of them initially think of purgatory as kind of like limbo, where it's like you're kind of in between heaven and hell, and maybe you'll go one way, maybe you'll go the other eventually, but it's sort of like a holding place. But for Dante, purgatory is just for Christians, baptized Christians who are on their way to paradise. You don't stay there forever, and you can't like go backwards, although you can linger at various levels of the mountain for a very long time. You don't end up in Inferno. Okay, why does this matter? Well, on one model, purgatory involves a lot of suffering, right? Making penance for, paying the final penalties for sins that could have been paid in this life by various acts in response to, what Christ has done for you. And so the idea is if someone, who is a Christian and so who's ultimately headed for paradise, so I count them as paradise bound, but who has committed some sins and hasn't made paid the final penalties for that in this life, if they die before they're able to pay off those penalties and they end up in purgatory for longer or for time that they wouldn't have been if they had lived longer, then a premature death can deprive that person of the goods in this life of, time to repent, make penance for those very sins. And had they had those goods, they would have missed out on all that suffering in purgatory. So here the idea is like you kind of modify, add in a little bit to the original diagram. You have this life and you have, paradise, everlasting life. But for someone who's got to finish, paying off the penalties for these sins in purgatory, it's not like had they died sooner, they would have gone straight to paradise. That might have meant more time or more suffering in purgatory. So it adds an extra layer to the kind of the initial model of how this works. And if, that's part of your theological picture, then I think it's pretty easy to, make sense of how death could be, all things considered, bad for a person. It would have been better for them not to have died then, to have lived longer, reconciled themselves with others, with God, with whatever the case may be. And it'll depend exactly on your tradition. But had those things happen in this life, think all things considered, that would have been better. So that's one way to go. I'm a Protestant, and there are some Protestants who do have like a doctorate of purgatory, including Jerry Walls, who was very helpful for me. I read his book on purgatory when writing this section of the paper. But most Protestants don't have purgatory in the picture, and I don't, even though I don't think it's like totally out there. And I really enjoy reading Dante talking about purgatory, because a lot of what he says there, I think, applies to my day-to-day life here in
Mhm.
this life. But anyway, so I don't think I don't take it too seriously as a kind of model that will really help solve the puzzle. But I'm not that far away from someone who could very easily see myself using it to resolve this puzzle.
Yeah. I will mention I've interviewed 2 Protestants who believe in purgatory and argue for it. One is Dr. Bob Hartman. He argues for a sanctification sort of view of purgatory. The other is Dr. Josh Thorough, and he argues for a more satisfaction for sins view of purgatory, even though both are Protestant. So viewers might be interested in checking those out. I'm like you. I think for a long time, I just had no good reason to believe in it.
Yeah.
And, but it's not like I had really good reason to not believe in it. I mean, some people might be like, it's not in scripture, but
Right.
that to me is not like a super good reason. Saying something is not, there's lots of things that aren't in scripture, but
Right. Right.
that we should believe in, even though they're
Right.
like not in the Bible. So that to
Yeah.
me is not like a really decisive reason or something like that. But after interviewing them, I was like, whoa, there's some good reasons to believe in purgatory. So I don't quite
Mm,
know where I land, but I'm much more sympathetic to the view now than I was previously. So
yeah. Yeah. And I guess as a Protestant, I'm going to be more tempted by, I don't know Josh's view well enough. It's probably related to his work on atonement,
yeah,
and we might have different views on how atonement works, but we do. But I guess I could see myself taking Bob's line and thinking, well, yeah, sanctification doesn't usually come to completion in this life. Maybe it never does.
right.
And you might wonder how, especially, he and I have different views of free will, but if free agency is required in that cooperation with God that's involved in your sanctification, it seems like for God to just kind of, snap his fingers and morally transform you right when you die, that would make it not as free or something like that. That said, you'll have to have Bob on to explain this. Maybe he did it in the other interview. We do have someone who I take it still needs a lot of sanctification in the thief on the cross, to whom Jesus says, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." And maybe you can't read too much into that, but like initially reading it, I read that as, oh, he's going straight to heaven. There's no mention of purgatory or this need for it. And, maybe I didn't know, maybe we don't know enough about the thief. Maybe he was pretty close. He just did this one, just had this one incident. Or maybe he was like John Valjean. It was like he's being punished for something that really wasn't that bad. But probably there are cases like, I don't know. I think it's probably fine to think this suggests the view that someone goes straight into heaven. So I guess, yeah, I'm not totally, against thinking, well, maybe there's a reason for purgatory, but I guess I lean the other way because of that sort of reason.
Yeah. The thief on the cross is an interesting pushback on Bob's view. I could go on talking about this. I have
Yeah, yeah.
thoughts on the thief on the cross, but for this interview is not about purgatory. So I think that maybe just whets people appetite and be like, "Oh, I want to go listen to that."
Hmm.
Okay, so what's the second version of this type of solution?
So if the first, the purgatory view depended on these other sort of theological commitments about purgatory, maybe philosophical, depending on how you get to believing in purgatory. The second response is coming more from the metaphysics of persons and personal identity. So the idea here is if you think that between a person's death and their entrance into paradise, there is a temporal gap, at least in their conscious experience, but perhaps there's a gap in their existence and their existence altogether, then you could make sense of how a continued life beyond the point of death would have been good and would not have meant missing out on the goods of paradise, because those are perhaps at some fixed future state. But it does require thinking that there's this gap, at least in your conscious experience, between death and perhaps the final resurrection. I mean, I think the philosophers, Christian philosophers who have done the most to kind of develop this suggestion are folks like Peter Van Imwagen and Trenton Merricks, who have more materialistic views of the human person. So it's not that you could exist as a sort of disembodied soul in an intermediate state, but rather it's something closer to something like what you see in Luther and others who maintain soul sleep, where between your death and the final resurrection, you just aren't aware of anything and perhaps don't exist. So I really like Merrick's way of talking about this. He has a chapter in a book on resurrection that's I would highly recommend. It's very fun.
I've
But
interviewed
he
him on that
Okay.
chapter, so
Oh,
people
nice.
check that out.
Man, I need to catch up on some of these videos. I haven't seen that one yet. But yeah, well, if you've seen that video, you'll know. But for those of you that haven't, you should check it out. He compares that gap in your existence between death and that resurrection to something like time travel. So if you imagine getting in a time machine, I'm a big fan of time travel, so I love, using that as an example. But if you set your time machine to some future date and you press go, and then all of a sudden you're there in the future, what's happened in those intervening years is that you didn't exist at those times. You skipped over them, right? And if you got out of the machine and you just went on with, living your life, no more time travel, if we were to like draw a map of your temporal existence, there'd be a big hole in the middle, all those, times that you jumped over in your time machine. So if that's what it's like when we die, we just jump forward to the resurrection, at least that's what it feels like consciously, then yes, I think, a later death would, provided that you would have been able to experience other goods, like you get deprived of those things by your premature death. And so it's all things considered bad for you. It's not like you're missing out on times that you would have been experiencing paradise had you lived longer. So I think that's another way of resolving the puzzle. So again,
That's a really
not feel,
interesting both the Purgatory version and this are, I find, like, really interesting sorts of
yeah.
ways of solving this puzzle.
Right, and I think, to me, it's like these would be compelling resolutions of the, puzzle if I had the views that they rely on. So if I believed in purgatory, if I was a materialist about, human persons, I think I would just say, "Oh yeah, problem solved. No puzzle about how death can be all things considered bad for the paradise bound." But again, if you're not going to have purgatory in the picture, or you're not thinking of purgatory in exactly the way that's required for that to work, or yeah, if you're not thinking of the resurrection in this way, then it's harder to make sense of these resolutions of the puzzle.
Right.
So yeah.
Okay. What about the third version of this solution?
Okay, so the third one I think is the one that I find most attractive, just given my other commitments. But it's also the one that is the most sketchy in my paper. I've definitely thought the least about. But the idea came from just thinking back to the way that, like, as a kid growing up in a Southern Baptist church, my Sunday school teachers talked about, doing good things in this life and what effects that will have in heaven. So this is related to some biblical language, but this is not a good way to think kind of theologically about good works in this life. But there's this idea that, like, we're going to cast our crowns at the feet of Jesus someday, and you get more jewels in your crown by sanctification or by doing good things here in this life. So the longer that you live and get more jewels in your crown, like, the better it is in heaven because you've got more crowns or more jewels in it or something along those lines. Now, I think that's kind of a silly version of the view. I don't think that's like a resolution of the puzzle, but it does suggest this idea that, like, how good things are for you in paradise might depend on how your life goes here. And that idea, didn't originate with my Sunday school teachers, right? It's been around a long time. I've been talking about Dante, you see it in him, and then, Aquinas and others, where how much you can enjoy the beatific vision might depend on how you were during this life or how sanctified you became in this life. So if there, I call this the like levels of paradise view. If there's like, this is no matter what level heaven is for you, right? It's going to automatically be better than temporal life. But there's like, low grade, mid grade, and high octane paradise. And you could, by living longer, miss out on some times of the lower grade paradise, but end up with, you know, higher grade paradise for eternity. Like, then it might be better for you to forego some of those, you know, paradisical moments with the lower grade paradise in view for less, tiny less, finite less, which is interesting because we're talking about an eternity, but for the sort of greater level of paradise forever. So if, for me to, this is the sort of thing that's motivating people like Bob Hartman, if for me to be more Christ-like, to grow in sanctification will require, more work, and it's going to require more time for me to stop giving in to the temptation to be impatient with my kids, to grow in charity and other virtues. If that's going to make it so that I'm better off forever in some sense, then it might be bad for me to be cut short of time developing those goods or, purging those vices in this life. That's kind of the way I'm thinking about it. So maybe at the end of the day, it's not that dissimilar to the purgatory view, but it's like, well, now we're talking about paradise itself and not just something on the
Mm.
way to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard similar things about the crowns. I haven't really investigated that in scripture to know, like, what's going on there, but I you've probably heard this one as well. Different sort of visual. Everyone in heaven experiences, like, complete fulfillment in God, and
Hmm.
so I've heard this picture of, like, we're all like jars, and we're all filled to the top, but there's, like,
Hmm.
different sizes of jars, and so it's like you're guaranteed to be fulfilled. It's
Right.
just you're gonna experience, like, a greater measure of God's fulfillingness, if that makes sense, than if say, if you live longer, you'd have this, like, greater measure
Right.
than if you die prematurely and you have, like, a reduced measure, but you're still fulfilled, that's the
Right.
yeah. You've
Yeah.
probably heard that same analogy.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that's what, Aquinas and Dante and others are getting at. But it does rely on thinking that like you can determine the size of your jar or something along those lines. And that depends on what you do with the time that you're given in this life. And so if some of it's taken away, you could have used it to, become a bigger jar. That that does seem like a bad thing. Like it seems all things considered, it would have been better for you to have lived a little bit longer here on earth and made it so that you could enjoy God more fully forever. Even though, had you, with the premature death, you still do get full fulfillment given what you're like at that time.
Mhm. Alright, well, I found this a really intriguing paper, puzzle. I hope my viewers appreciate the puzzle as well and find it fun to think through. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, I guess I encourage people to think about it more. There's not a whole lot of philosophical reflection on the afterlife. That was definitely true when I started working on this paper. There's been a lot in the last 10 years. So it's not like there's nothing out there. But, I would encourage more Christians to think about it, to read up on the literature about deprivationism versus Epicureanism, sort of traditional debate in the philosophy of death, whether it can be bad, and then see what we can mine from that literature to wrestle with solutions to this puzzle for those that are thinking of paradise.
Alright, well, thank you for letting me interview you, Taylor.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Whenever death and Christianity come up, the topic of hell often does as well. And there is a tension here. How can a perfectly good and perfectly loving God punish anyone for eternity? Click here to hear a shocking answer to that question.